All right, folks, here we go with the notes for Chapter 11, talking now about self-regulation and ethics. In the previous chapter, we talked more about some of the regulations that are imposed on the broadcast industry, and now we're going to talk more about some of the things that the industry itself tries to do. Codes are written statements of principle that guide the general behavior of those working in a profession. Code statements can be one of two different types of forms. They can either be prescriptive. In other words, they're things that prescribe for someone to do something or for an organization to do something. Kind of like a prescription is something your doctor writes for you to take whenever you have to take medication. So a prescriptive sort of code would be one that says you have to do something, while a proscriptive code would be one that is more prohibitive, restrictive, which talks more about things that you should not do. So prescriptive, thou shalt do this, or proscriptive, thou shalt not do this. The NAB code was a code that was developed by the National Association of Broadcasters, and it had been around from the late 1920s right up until about 1983. And it had been revised in various forms throughout its existence. What it did was that it basically tried to cover various aspects of the way that broadcasters should conduct themselves, and it looked at it from two different aspects. One was from the aspect of programming. So the NAB code would cover things like the way that news presentation should happen, political broadcasting, how to deal with things like religion and community responsibility, also standards as it came to programming for children. And then on the advertising side, the NAB code would have guidelines about what sort of products were acceptable to advertise, some of the rules for the presentation of broadcast ads, timing standards. They actually put into place limits on the amount of commercials that you could have per hour. And these were things that NAB member stations were asked to abide by. Now, there actually were some court cases in which it made it sort of kind of discriminatory and actually seen by the government as not really a good thing to do, to say that there was a limit on commercial advertising, because it created a kind of a false sense of the concept of supply and demand across the industry. And they were accused of doing that so that they could inflate advertising prices. So that eventually came off of the table, but then the NAB code came out of existence altogether in 1983. But many broadcasters still hold to some of the standards and practices that were originally put out by the NAB code, or at the very least use it as a basis for developing their own philosophies of how they operate. Some other codes and policies are put out by various associations within the industry. The RTNDA, the Radio and Television News Directors Association, has a 6-article code of broadcast news ethics that covers items ranging from courtroom coverage to privacy invasions and how to deal with those things in particular situations. The SPJ, the Society of Professional Journalists, also has a code of ethics that covers all media, including broadcasting. This code covers topics like fair play, accuracy, objectivity, and press responsibility. So it covers every aspect of news reporting, not just TV and radio. The American Advertising Federation and the Association of Better Business Bureaus International have developed a 9-item code that deals with such topics as truth in advertising, taste and decency, and responsibility. And we'll talk a little bit more about how these organizations play a role in that later on in the chapter. Now, to help guard against bad decisions, many stations have developed their own policy guidelines covering sensitive issues, including all the ones that we had talked about previously. Because there isn't these days kind of a universal standard, although these different associations try to give strong guidelines as to how to conduct yourselves in the industry. But ultimately, as broadcasting is a business and each business has its own mission and vision, you have the right as a business owner, as a business entity, to set up your own standards and practices as long as they don't conflict with anything, well, basically wouldn't be anything illegal that you would do. Written codes, however, are not without controversy. There's pros and cons to them. First, the pros. They indicate to the general public that the media organization is sensitive to its ethical duties. Now, it may be that what they decide is an ethical standard, people may disagree with, but there's at least that sense that, hey, we have this written code of ethics. Here it is. This is what we live by. And that is something that many people tend to respect, at least on a certain level. Also, they ensure that every employee understands what the company views are in terms of the correct behavior and the way to conduct themselves. So it's written into the policy for employees to follow, so that they are in alignment with the philosophy of the organization. Now, the cons. Any company policy statement that covers the entire workings of the organization will have to be worded so vaguely that it'll be of little use in specific day-to-day decision making. It's not a very detailed document by and large in most organizations. So there's a little bit of room for interpretation as to what fits a certain standard and what doesn't. And sometimes what the interpretation is, at least from the perspective of management, may not come around until after a situation has happened, or a decision is made perhaps during the moment that a situation is happening. Also, a written code or policy statement might actually be used against a radio or TV station in court. In the previous chapter, where we talked about things like libel and slander, those can be issues that, if there's a written code of conduct that a TV or radio station has, might be used against them in court. Other standards and practices where they chose to invade someone's privacy or disclose a source or something like that, and someone wanted to call them to task on that, that code of ethics could be brought in as evidence. New ethical problems constantly emerge and new guidelines have to be written. So the code of ethics ought to be a living document for various reasons, not just because new problems arise that we've never encountered before, but there can also be changes in the cultural atmosphere. There can be changes that are different from market to market. The ways that different things are handled, and perhaps it's not always going to be a black and white sort of thing that you have to do this in every particular circumstance when it happens. So there's always going to be the opportunity to review and revise a code of ethics statement. Most policy statements and guidelines are directed at the individual, whereas ethical problems are increasingly originating at the corporate level. This gets into the discussion about the industry getting too big for itself, really, where we've talked about the different issues of vertical integration, where you have one company that oversees lots of other smaller companies and different entities doing different things. You may have executives that are so far removed from the everyday happenings that, number one, they're not aware of what's happening at the local level. And because of the interests of the company at large, there may be things that happen that are of a unscrupulous or compromising sort of approach to the way that those things are done. And sometimes it's the ones that write those very codes that are the ones that are breaking those codes. Now, the departments of standards and practice, that used to be a thing in just about every organization. Many of them still have them. Basically, what's going on here is that the major broadcast and cable networks maintain staffs to make sure that their commercials and programs do not offend advertisers, affiliated stations, and cable systems, audience members, also the FCC. They're constantly trying to make sure that they're walking a certain line in an attempt to ruffle as few feathers as they possibly can. Now, sometimes there are departments of standards and practices or similar types of organizations that is a major part of their job. Many times, especially in smaller organizations, that job tends to fall on a certain member or perhaps a couple members of the management team. Standards concerning what's acceptable on television have changed dramatically over the years, and so a few factors that have played into that. First off, society standards have become more tolerant. If you read this section in the textbook, you will see how certain shows did certain things that back in the day were rather taboo, that we wouldn't really think much about in television today. And even these days, we're starting to see more and more things that are appearing on the screen that are pushing the envelope in terms of what might be considered in good taste, what sort of things are acceptable or not acceptable in society. And those topics continue to come up by virtue of the portrayal of certain types of content on television. The success of premium cable series like Sex and the City, Californication, Secret Diary of a Call Girl, and many, many other shows have encouraged broadcasters and other cable networks to go to greater lengths to compete with pay channels. People are looking for more intense types of content, more controversial types of content, or content that is just matching up with the culture of the day. And because of that, and certain cable networks being willing to be a little more daring in airing those types of things, broadcast outlets have also kind of pushed themselves and tried to get away with airing certain types of content that it believes its audience wants, while also walking that fine line of what is acceptable in the eyes of the government and in the eyes of the viewers of its particular market. Thirdly, the V-chip allows program creators to alert the audience to possibly to what might possibly be objectionable content. It relieves programmers of some of the burden of self-regulation and passes it on to the viewer. Part of what has been a long-standing issue within the quote-unquote battle of what is acceptable over the airwaves has been this idea of television and radio being things that are kind of intrusive into the home in some ways, where the viewer, the listener, may not have 100% control of what is being brought out over the airwaves. Now, of course, the viewer, the listener can always change the channel or turn the radio or TV off and things like that. But there's been that long-standing principle that people should expect to not be unduly subjected to certain types of content when they turn on entertainment in their home. The V-chip now allows for the viewer himself, herself, to decide if certain content is going to be allowed in the home or not. And it's law now that all television sets 13 inches or larger have to include this V-chip technology, so they can actually program if certain types of content are about to come on TV, that it can block that content. The acceptability of certain TV or radio messages depends on several factors. First off, the size of the market. Certain things tend to be acceptable or not acceptable in larger markets, i.e. more urban areas, than they do in smaller markets. Whether the content is appropriate by certain standards, this kind of gets into arguments of liberal versus conservative, traditional versus progressive, and those sorts of things. So that is one factor. Second, the time period that we're talking about. Stations tend to be more careful if there's a good chance that children will be in the audience. And we talked about previously the safe zone within broadcasting, where more adult type of content might be found on the airwaves between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. local time. Thirdly, the station's audience. Stations will air content that its audience expects. If it is a more traditional audience, they will be much more conservative with the types of content that they show. If it's an audience that tends to expect raunchy types of material or material that's more violent, then it's going to do its best to give the audience what it wants. And then fourthly, the type of content itself. What is going to be able to be aired legally? How is that content going to be viewed in light of the audience and the market and all those sorts of things? So all four of those factors play into what a station decides is going to be fit to put over its airwaves. Let's go back to talking about the V-chip for a moment. The V-chip, as I mentioned, was written into the law, the Telecommunications Act of 1996. All devices 13 inches or larger, as far as TV sets go, have to have V-chip technology in place. Now, the way that the V-chip works is that it's going to recognize whenever a show has a certain rating, and that is communicated through, and the V-chip can filter out shows that contain certain types of content or certain types of ratings. The rating carries two pieces of information. It carries the audience for which the program is appropriate, and it carries information about the content of the program. So that's whenever you watch at the beginning of a show or the beginning of a TV segment, the box that's usually in the upper corner of your television screen, the rating that is there, those codes carry that sort of information. Here's what those codes mean. TVY is programming that's suitable for all children. TVY7 gives the green light for children ages 7 and above. TVG, general audiences. TVPG, parental guidance suggested. TV14, parents strongly cautioned for children under 14. And then mature audiences, TVMA. The rating system somewhat similar to how the Motion Picture Association of America rates movies that come out in the theaters. They actually kind of took a page from them when they developed this system. Not exactly the same, but the spirit and intent is there. Of course, the ratings for television also involve different types of content notations. FV standing for fantasy violence. You might see this with the TVY7 category for parents that are concerned about that. D standing for suggestive dialogue. L standing for coarse language. S for sexual situations, and V for violence. So all these things can be programmed to be monitored by a V-chip. Now, some other groups that are trying to put their say into what is going on in the world of TV and radio, include various professional groups, I should say. These are folks within the industry. Professional groups are trade and industry organizations that offer their members advice about research, technical, legal, and management issues. Professional groups contribute to self-regulation in both formal and informal ways. Let's talk about those briefly. On the informal level, each group sponsors conventions and meetings where members exchange relevant business and professional information. Lots of networking going on between different executives and managers and other folks within the industry, and they're sharing information and philosophies and all that sort of thing. The most elaborate system of formal self-regulation by a professional group deals with national advertising. And we're going to talk about this in a little more detail here. As far as regulating advertising within the industry, let's say a commercial comes on and there's an accusation that the commercial is not keeping with truth in advertising standards. Complaints about deceptive advertising can be filed with the NAD, the National Advertising Division of the Council of Better Business Bureaus. And they can make a decision and determination about whether that claim is legitimate or not. If the NAD decides that an advertiser is not being truthful in its ads, they can tell that advertiser to take those ads down. Advertiser can appeal that decision. They do that through the National Advertising Review Board. And then after those steps, if an advertiser still refuses to quit making certain claims on advertising, the advertiser can be referred to the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, or to another government agency, and then the government may step in. Now, citizens groups, those outside the industry that try to have a certain amount of influence, some of the major issues that citizens groups tend to be passionate about include the portrayal of minorities. Groups representing various minorities and cultural groups have also pressured the networks to eliminate stereotyped portrayals. You could also include in this those that live certain lifestyles. They tend to have groups that advocate for them as well. Also, another hot button issue for many citizen groups, presentation of sex and violence. Groups like the Parents Television Council and Morality in Media have campaigned against obscene content. Children's programming, another hot topic. Groups monitor the enforcement of requirements from the Children's Television Act of 1990. We talked about that previously. One of the tenets of that act is that television stations, broadcast television stations, are required to air a minimum of 156 hours a year of EI programming, educational instructional programming. And that can break down into 3 hours a week or 2 hours a week plus the remaining hours being carried as special programming throughout the year. It used to just be a blanket 3 hours a week, but in 1999 they changed the language in that law. Now, the effects on some of these citizen groups is that because they kind of speak rather loudly and make a bunch of noise whenever they make complaints and things like that, the industry is very much aware of them. And they try to avoid confrontation with them. What winds up happening is that the broadcast outlets do a certain amount of self-censorship, but in doing so, what may happen is that they will appease a group that perhaps is more loud than the other, may not necessarily represent the ideals of the population at large, or even if there is kind of an evenness about what certain people feel, there's always that danger of making some people happy and then offending others. at the same time. It's a very tight rope that broadcasters walk when they try to navigate through some of these issues, especially if you have people from differing opinions that are trying to make their voices heard and doing so rather loudly. So it's a really, really tough thing for broadcasters to navigate through. So with that, we're going to take a break and we will finish up the chapter in part B of chapter 11. I'll see you over there.